Thank you all for that panel. I think for this workshop in general, I really enjoyed Sarah's talk because it's getting directly to this. But I think it's important that beyond topic, we talk about method and archive and citation. And so this panel touches a lot on my own research, so I know a lot of these archives. So I wanted to ask about the archives and shaping the limits of AI history. And who's done research? I'll be short. Who's done research at the RAND Corporation? Yeah, it's extremely sterile and policing, and you have to know what you're looking for before you go in there. So it's really difficult to read beyond the archive because you can't. You have to abide by the command and control logics and the history given to it. And this similar with the military documentation. It's so seductive, not seductive, it's so entrenching. So it kind of limits the stories. And then you're looking at media inconsistencies with the media and what the professors are saying about the occupiers versus the logics of the resistance movement. So my question to all of you is what sort of limitations are you finding with the archive in our histories of AI?
So I think that's a really great and super important question. It's one that I'm grappling with right now. Again, I'm at the very early stages of this, but I also grappled with in my dissertation work. So in this project, one of the things that I think I'm going to have to deal with is that there are gaps in what resources are still available from this time. So the best archive that I can find of CPP's own materials is missing some of the crucial issues where like key decisions were announced, like the name change. That issue appears to not have been, it's not at any library that I can find. I have some ideas on other sources, but I'm also very cognizant of the way that the archives that do exist are told in their voice and the way that it's going to be important to triangulate. So one thing I'm keen to do is to look across different sort of more official archives to see where they show up. FOIA, I think, is going to actually end up being an important tool because it appears like some government agencies were poking around into what members of this group are doing. And then oral history, I think, is a really critical resource here too. And I had similar experiences. My dissertation work looked at cryptography, which I was dealing with like classification as an issue too. And they're working across lots of different archives and getting creative in where I could get my information. Also helped me to find, like, for example, where one document was redacted, the copy that was stored somewhere else might have been redacted differently, and I could sort of like puzzle together stuff that would have been tricky to find otherwise, but I'll let others answer that question too.
So in my case, obviously, when you're dealing with anything military post-World War II and nuclear weapons and particular security classification is a problem that is problematic in all the ways that you can imagine, so I won't say too much more about that. But also the issue of, given the extensive use of private contractors, the volume of material that is relevant to these stories that is locked up in private or corporate archives is also a very stringent limitation. But actually, government documents that are held in private archives under some sort of management contract with the government actually are subject to FOIA, but good luck unsorting that tangle in order to actually get the documents out. And one further point, that something that is generalizable beyond the military, beyond government, to just large organizations and bureaucracies in general, is that they generate so much paperwork, which it's in the name. And they don't know what's important when they destroy things or when they store things. Consequently, you don't know what's important when you go and look through their collections, because people just empty their filing cabinets into big boxes, and then they end up in the National Archives and never get processed for 60, 70 years. So I've rifled through plenty of boxes with lots of interesting documents, but there's no, without extensive cross-referencing between different offices, does the paper appear in different places? Is it something that someone in something that circulated, or is it just something that sat on someone's desk drawer? There's no guide to that. There's very little sense of what is significant, what deserves attention, and how. I mean, these are effectively work materials, how they were actually used and what they were used for. Any other comments?
Yeah, I would just echo the importance of oral history. I think especially as a way of checking internal histories that are often written by a lot of these actors, because, you know, I think the developments that to many of my characters were the most, or my actors were the most important, often frames out what's going on in the periphery of their work. And then the other factor is in histories of automation, I've noticed, like, for instance, the history of the automation of financial workers is highly documented because it's a history of an automation of a professional field. And to be a professional is to have the kind of privilege to document your own history and resistance.
Mhm.
But in other areas of automation, those histories of resistance are buried much deeper because they preceded the existence of a coherent professional identity.
Okay, in my case, I couldn't do oral history because Rosenblatt died very early. I was in the last days, I was in Washington's National Archive, and they have only one file, and that is an audio file. And I asked for a copy and they couldn't find it. So they said I have to fill a form, and I did. So I hope they can send it, but I'm not sure about that. Cornell University sent me everything I asked for, so there was no problem. And I just started, so I have to ask in military archives, but I didn't do until now.
I didn't do any archival research for my presentation, but I did download a lot of papers on archive.org. So I can give you some tips about doing research of the history of the present later if you want. But we should go to the next question.
Next question, David.
Hi, so thank you all for those talks. I really enjoyed it so far. And I'm Dan Belkin. I'm an interloper here today, but I'm happy to hear these talks. I had a similar question, I think, to Theo, and so I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way, which is to say that especially like listening to Devin and Michael and Rudy's talks to begin with, I started thinking, well, how fascinating. We're hearing talks about finance, about processing psychological tests for corporations, presumably at some level, public health, about game theoretical implications, right? These are big, serious, practical topics, but they're academics writing these papers. And why are we writing about them? Well, they publish papers, right? Like they might have their own archives that exist that we can read about. So the question is, are these the most important places to actually tell these stories, or are the real important stories hidden in corporate archives or somewhere else? Like, why are we telling these stories and not other stories? If you recognizing, of course, there's limits to the archives we can get, where would you want to, maybe you're gonna say, no, this is where the story really is important for the history of AI. But if it's not, where is the really important story?
I guess I would start by saying that ultimately it's a question of how you're framing what the history of AI is, and to what extent you believe that any kind of intellectual history is going to provide some insight into a broader social or political question that might interest you. I think for me, I'm trying to situate an intellectual history in a political economic context, but that's not the same as, you know, and to shed light on a transition in an intellectual that might have otherwise been told in an intellectual historical narrative, but inflected with a different dynamic. But that's different from what you're saying, which is, you know, if we're talking about, like, for instance, in my own work about the 1960s as a process of vast financialization, yeah, this wouldn't be, I don't think this is the story that I would tell about it. It would be, you know, something about the story I alluded to at the end, which is about, the rise of pension fund investing in Wall Street, institutionalization of wealth. But it corresponds to a story from the history of science. But I think there's still value in the latter told as a self.
I mean, I guess I feel that doing a history of sort of the economic influences on AI is something that's sort of necessary in order to maybe like break down the sort of ideological barriers that it's created, right? So you can't, even if you have a great idea about generative adversarial networks, if you don't know game theory, you're not going to get your paper accepted into these conferences, right? Even though it may not be the best formalization or, best way to think about it. And so, like I see the sort of goal to be to create a technical culture that is kind of more reflexive about the sort of origins of their ideas, and can propose alternatives, perhaps not in the conferences that currently exist, but maybe in future conferences or some other venues. I guess that's sort of the way I think about it.
One thing that I would like to bring up in connection with that is that I think there's an inherent shortcoming in the way that that professional historians practice history, which is primarily as individuals. And there's an old proverb that academics write stories about academics because academics leave their mail in places where other academics like to go. Even setting that aside, when you're talking, if you want to sort of shift the locus of attention from a single person, a single or one professor or a small group of professors to larger entities, bureaucracies that have large management apparatuses, to make sense of the volume of material, I mean, the kinds of professionals who deal with these kinds of sources are attorneys with armies of interns and paralegals and document departments, and I really don't know how histories of that move sort of beyond the scope of the individual, the community, the discipline, could even be written by the historical discipline as it's presently organized.
I obviously am very sympathetic to the premise at the core of the question, because that's kind of the framing of this project, is to ask like why. So if this conference, I think, is working to try and tell different histories of AI than are sort of commonly known, and I think that's critical work. And so I think that one of the questions that we're asking is, why do we see this as this sort of military and industrial version of AI? Why is that told as the dominant history? Why has that sort of led up until now? And I think it's a difficult question to answer, but I think it's a really critical one. In addition to surfacing the multiplicity of other histories of AI, and I just want to call out how incredibly rich it has been in this conference so far, particularly to see like different global perspectives on it, because I think it surfaces the ways in which the current framing of what AI is and what AI does has been very narrow, but is not necessarily inherently valid in the way that it's commonly thought to be.
I'm going to use my chair privilege to build on that. I'm curious, Sarah, for you guys, in calling the project that you're setting out on a radical history, does that not legitimize, isn't it in response to a radical history of AI? Like the history we have now seems to be, amongst this community at least, totally unfit for the kind of, it's being reworked by this community. So curious your thoughts on that. And for the rest of the group, building off of your project, if computing people for peace, if peace was the organizing principle for the logic of the opposition, I'm curious in the projects you guys are working on, especially Dan and Devin, what was the organizing logic behind the alternative, like the alternative systems to the ones that you guys characterized? what were the memes or the kind of the logics that brought those alternative communities together?
So to your question, I think it's a really good one, and it's one that we're, we'll take some thinking through, because in some ways it positions these histories as an alternative or as marginal rather than as central, and part of the core dominant workforce that has been shaping AI for decades. So I think it's a fair point, and it's something that we'll need to keep thinking through. But I think that from the ideas that we're trying to grapple with have to do with rethreading the notion of AI as political through this history that's told about AI.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think in some ways, this helps me respond a little bit better to what Dan was asking too, which is just to say that I think what I'm trying to tell is understand the tools of power that are enacted in these algorithmic techniques. So for me, the development of heuristic decision-making in the 1950s in relation to the job shop problem is an interesting intellectual story, but it's also in relationship to a history of decentralization in American industry, which is in response to labor organizing, in which management theorists are not just interesting academics, but they're trying to respond to the needs of industrial powers to recreate efficiency in light of suburbanization, or in this financial story of stories of efforts to make capital move more efficiently by automating the human work of decision making that packages financial objects. But those are, to go back to the critique that was at the heart of Dan's and maybe some of the early points, these are still stories of the powerful, and I don't mean to reify them, but rather to by exposing, by showing them, see what the contingencies are, I guess.
Sort of similarly, the actors in my story are by no means radicals. They're a community that has enjoyed a significant degree of influence over technology policy for quite a long time, and are interested in upholding that. And there are something that I didn't address explicitly, is that they do have beneath all of this sort of postulation about what nuclear war might look like if we go down this very bad path that we seem to be going down, unless you listen to us, the experts. There are some sort of bureaucratic political stakes in that a number of these individuals want to see management of these projects elevated from or removed from the Department of the Air Force and put directly under the Department of Defense, based on the argument that the behavior of these systems affects the way that it implicates the entire nation and the course of the entire nation, and so it should be under an authority higher than the Air Force. Would that have changed the outcome? In some ways, yes, but in terms of its sort of broad strokes, I think not. So the alternative in this case is less about a concrete system proposal as a different structure of power, distribution of power and decision-making authority within the government.
Questions?
Hi, thank you. I'm not going to ask the whole panel a question, if that's all right. I think sometimes particular is good too. So I wanted to ask Michael just about this idea. I found it very attractive of the epistemic ensembles, if that's the right phrasing of what you're talking about. And I'm just wondering, like practically in the deep learning example, where do you see that cashing out? And I asked this question to be particular, but it's obviously applicable to a lot of other things that are happening. Is it something that you see like multiple different epistemic
like ways of finding knowledge in the world operating like within a single paper? Is it something that happens within a large community? Is it distributed over these conferences? Because to me, like the advantage, so it seems like we can say there's a plurality of things going on, and that lifts our obligation to be synthetic about any of the phenomena that we're trying to identify. But like these things evolve clearly. There's a clear, for me, I'm thinking in these papers, you see sometimes this connectionist attitude is like exposed and justifying the model, and then you turn to this kind of behaviorist idea to justify your training procedures, and then you move to another kind of epistemic language, even in the course of a single paper, you know. So I'm just wondering where you see that stuff cashing out. What level do you see that kind of plurality happening on?
I'm not sure what you mean by cashing out, but I think that the origin of the idea is really just a way to sort of deal with the rhetoric of the revolution, right? And I think for history of science, kind of, you know, like space, everyone here is sort of familiar with trying to argue about like whether, or, you know, in what ways scientific revolutions are not revolutionary, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was more just a way to characterize what I sort of, you know, experienced by both like, you know, sort of doing this stuff and then also like, you know, observing people do it and reading the papers. Is just, yeah, you know, that there was aspects of all of these sort of supposed past scientific revolutions, ones that were over, you know, coming back in a way that, you know, were at such a distance that they were unconscious to the practitioners. So the practitioners, you know, are like 21, 22 years old, and they don't know anything about the history of psychology. And all of a sudden, history of psychology seems extraordinarily relevant to this stuff, you know. And so, yeah, it's really just a way to sort of talk about, you know, what's new without using the language of a revolution. And there may be a better way to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. These topics are very near and dear to my heart. And this has been a tremendously helpful panel for my own thinking. I'm no stranger to downloading lots of articles to try to understand what's going on. And articles play a large role, various documents play a large role in all the talks that we're given here. And I certainly agree that like oral histories is one way of interrogating those documents and reading the oral histories against the documents to look for gaps. Another way that you might interrogate sort of predominant narratives is by looking at how the material devices themselves like interpose their own sorts of constraints on theorizing. So rather than you have a theory and you put that information into a device that does things for you, you can, like, my experience has been looking at some of these topics is that it's exactly the opposite, right? That the computing devices dictate how you can theorize and the ways that you want to theorize. So my question for the entire panel, for anyone who would like to answer the question, how has material devices or concerns about materiality in general informed the historical topics that you've each investigated? Thank you very much.
I have a story. I mean, the story that I collapsed here about Harry Markowitz, who's this influential financial theorist, he was at Rand really in parallel with Herb Simon during the period that Stephanie describes, and has a quite similar pathway to his own. Like he butts up against the practicalities of dealing with computers in a way that requires that he reconceptualize human reasoning in a way quite like Herb Simon. So I compressed the story a little bit, but the limitations of machines are super important, I think, for thinking about a wide range of forms of bounded reasoning, certainly I think probably in every domain of decision making during this period, but certainly in financial decision making. Because there just aren't that many computers either. So that when you're trying to develop an applied science, you have to deal with the fact that the practitioners you're describing a method to won't have the device to actually accomplish it.
So I want to push a little bit on the question. It took me a second to sort of like think through how that works through in this particular project. And in the framing of the question, you talked about how like you can use oral history to investigate the gaps in documents, or how the machine dictates the way that the history is written. And I think in the way that I'm thinking through this space, oral history is a way of getting at the very real human conditions that are underlying, you know, the development and deployment of AI and who it affects and in what ways it affects things. So I'm not thinking of oral history as a way of filling in a written record, but as, you know, that's where the history itself is going to be situated. It's in the voices of those who don't really make it as much into the written record. And then in the also the material working conditions under which people are, you know, are laboring. One thing that I'm thinking about in particular is like the process of putting together the zine for Computer People for Peace, which was distributed, you know, very widely. One was really difficult. So all of those images that I was showing came from the zine itself. They had their own, you know, people were doing the art. They you know, were working on the mimeographs, and that was really difficult to do the cut and pasting work. They're very complex issues that they put together. But also importantly, the process of putting it together was distributed. Everybody was involved with the labor. That was not something that, you know, was constructed in a hierarchical way. And that the mode of group operation, I think, reflects the kind of politics that that group wanted to see throughout the entire tech industry. That we're all computer people, there isn't a hierarchy of labor, and also we should not see the development and deployment of AI technologies reify those kinds of class distinctions more broadly.
I mean, I think it's a huge problem in doing this kind of study by reading papers that basically, you know, when something doesn't work, they don't publish it. It's just the, you know, it's negative results. And the negative result is often the result of pushing against a machine in a way that it doesn't like. And so I think it just goes back to the sort of importance of interviews and oral histories. And I mean, I would say, you know, for doing sort of the history of the present, you know, like there are actually quite a few podcasts out there where sort of people talk about the research of like the last 2 months or something, and that will reveal a lot of things about the present in an interesting way. And we should probably be archiving those. But yeah, I don't have an answer for you other than that I share your sort of struggle to figure out what the challenges actually were at any given point in history.
Questions, Keely?
Thank you all so much. So this kind of follows up on Sarah's last point, because I was really struck by the sort of changing P from professionals to people, and then, you know, later on in your story, eventually, like CPSR does maintain the professional P in that valence. And in a way, maybe this is a bit of a naive question, but to what extent are all of these stories critiques of technocracy itself? The way in which it might not be so naive, but there's maybe a bit of a twist to that, is that we can see, at least like in Devin's story, the attempt to rationalize sort of the investor's decision-making is itself sort of a statement about sort of doing away with the uniqueness of the hunch or the intuition of the portfolio manager, right? In an attempt to say this should be opened up in a more sort of, it's a story of accessibility in some sense. And in Dan, I took some of your critique to be that it was a failure to detach it from the technocratic bureaucracy and take on the sort of mediating role that computers could take. So in some sense, what we're used to perhaps hearing in a critical narrative as a moment of a land grab through the introduction of a computer. I think we heard a few narratives, at least when that seems to be a statement about sort of opening up these sites of decision-making. Yeah. So the question would be as to what extent you see it as a critique of technocracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the approach, to return to something I said before, that's certainly the approach that I have when I go into this as a critique of these, you know, capitalist utilizations of computing systems to further intensify, you know, industrial financial capital. Economists use this phrase in the period that I described. They describe the institutionalization of wealth, this process whereby the individuals, workers become more invested in financial markets and yet more highly mediated in their interaction with financial markets through a series of intermediaries and financial objects. And so I think in a way that's akin to Dan's story, you know, you have a a transformation that's ongoing in post-war, where the forms of power are increasingly couched in these technical systems that are, or human institutions that really no one can have control of anymore.
Something that I've tried and something that I'd really like to see is sort of demystification of the cult of the executive. The critique of technocracy being presented by the technocrats in the story that I had to tell is that what has the potential of being lost is the prerogative of the executive, and what needs to be what needs to be preserved is the right of the most powerful people who hold power by virtue of bureaucratic authority to be the decision makers, and to the ideal that all of these other constraints that may be placed upon them by their material environment, by work processes, that these should be minimized and shaped in such a way that it actually makes the executive more powerful. And I don't want to sort of submit to the sort of assumption that the CEO, the decider decides, and that based on our just sort of intuition about how legitimate bureaucratic processes are supposed to function. Any other responses?
I'll give a really quick one, because you kind of already like answered in the question. That's sort of the straightforward, like, obviously there's a deep critique of technocracy in everything that this group is doing. The higher order question that I think I want to be asking throughout the project too, though, is what does it mean that sort of this tech worker, fairly elite group of individuals, although they're self-critical, what does it mean that that's sort of the locus of change? That I think is a related question that I don't really have the answer to, but is sort of foregrounded in my mind as I'm digging through these materials.
I think we have time for one last question from the group.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this panel, and I have a question that is at least inspired by Michael's talk, just not to limit the respondents to it, but you brought up Phil Agre and critical technical practice, and of course, which for Phil Agre was about reforming AI practice itself, and you gestured towards that, I think, too, in your response to one of the other questions. And so what I was curious about is, in a context where we've talked a lot about regulation, about questions of access and things like this, to what extent do any of these histories have things to say to AI practitioners themselves, or should be addressed to AI practitioners, or have bearing on the actual creation or imagination or some dimension of the production of AI technologies, if that makes sense?
I'm not sure, sorry, and I understand. So you're asking, like, how should this stuff be addressed to them, or should it be, or?
I'm just sort of wondering about, I mean, I guess, following whatever line of thought you had in bringing the sort of critical technical practice stuff to the talk would certainly probably constitute an answer to that. But sort of generally thinking about it generally too, I'm just sort of wondering about, do any of these histories, any of the things we're kind of coming up with, any of the stories we're telling here have messages for, or like guidelines, or give us any leverage for thinking about or imagining AI technologies themselves as part of or independent of the kind of systems that surround them?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it comes out of my sort of personal experience. You like get confronted with deep learning, and you're like, where the heck did all of this come from? If you're me, and if you're not, then you just go on and you make cool deep learning models and you get a job. But I don't think it's possible to really understand it without the historical perspective, which is why I wind up at panels like this, despite not being like a sort of like full-on historian. I do believe that it can have an ideological effect. I think that you can, if you explain the history of where your everyday ideas that are unconscious and you never think about where they come from, it might provoke something, right? And I think that, histories of protests in Silicon Valley, you tell someone that back in the 60s, people would like put car bombs in Volkswagens and park them outside David Packard's house. And they're like, what? But like that kind of stuff like that did happen. So, it can provide openings to sort of understanding what type of activism we might need, today, and not just intellectually, but, politically and other domains as well.
Just to conclude, or Dan, do you have? Please.
Very, very quickly, I would say that one thing to consider in the development of artificial intelligence is the consideration not only of what the algorithm, what the model, what the network, what it enables, but also what is it going to push people to do, because the purpose for which it was designed may sort of inspire a sort of feedback cycle where using the tool then makes the tool sort of becomes deeply ingrained in the way that that people think about the world, and seeing as a lot of the concern that we have about AI is about how organizations will use them to think about some of these questions about what these tools, not only in terms of functionally, what will they enable organizations to do, but what will they even, what sort of cycle, what sort of engine might it create within an organization.
Okay, so before everybody stands up, Rudy, I want to ask you a question because I feel like you've not got as many questions today, and that is, it seems like one different tack that all of you could have taken was to talk about the personal politics of some of the actors involved in your story. And this hasn't been a part of the history so far, really. We haven't made much of the fact that McCarthy was a card-carrying Marxist at the time when he coined the term AI, and, Simon as well. And Rosenblatt, his brother was a big Washington lobbyist who worked against McCarthy, and Rosenblatt developed the first kind of voter profiling, personality profiling system using his personality research. And I just wonder, have you come across that in your search yet on the perceptron, and will it be part of your story, his politics?
It will be part of my story, but I haven't been across that until now, no. I'm just starting, and I did some other project before, so no, until now I didn't.
Okay, well, let's have a round of applause for the panel. It's now lunchtime, but before you stand up, I'm going to have one more round of applause for the people that have taken care of our food here. And we'll start again at 2 o'clock.